I'm Ali Aslan, and I have the great pleasure now of hosting and moderating a very timely, very crucial panel, both to the US, to Europe, but also to Turkey, of course, titled The Transatlantic Relationship and the Future of the West. Well, throughout the last century, the transatlantic relationships were certainly the main pillar of both European and American foreign policy. If that is still the case, that is, of course, the million-dollar question we're going to ask here today, because we all know the transatlantic relationship and the future of the West is in motion at the very latest throughout the Trump presidency, but certainly also looking at the most recent events in Afghanistan. Much to talk about on this session. I couldn't have asked for a better panel and panelists to answer all those pertinent questions that we're going to address. Now with us is Nikolaus Meyer-Landrut, who is the EU ambassador and head of the European Union delegation to Turkey. Welcome, Ambassador. Also is Gülnur Aybet, who's the senior advisor to the Turkish president and a professor at Turkey's National Defense University. Delighted to be joined by Johnny McLaughlin, who is Distinguished Practitioner in Residence at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. He's had a lengthy career in U.S. intelligence and was the CIA's former acting director. And last but certainly not least, we are joined by Riccardo Alcaro, who is a research coordinator and head of the Global Actors Program of the Istituto Affari Internazionali, Italy's leading policy think tank. Welcome to you all to this very timely session. Nikolaus Meyer-Landrut, as I was saying before, the transatlantic relationships were certainly one of the, if not the main pillar of European foreign policy. Things have changed quite a bit in previous years. How would you rate, how would you assess the current state of the transatlantic relationships today?
Well, thank you very much, first of all, for inviting me to this very important discussion and this distinguished panel. This is a pleasure to be with you. I would start by saying that both the European Union and NATO will remain the key institutions in terms of the backbones, if you want, to what you describe as a Western world. They clearly will adapt, have to adapt. They have been evolving in the past, but their fundamentals are probably more solid than some might see them from the outside. So I'm quite confident that both for transatlantic relations and for European integration, both NATO and EU will remain the key institutions for the foreseeable future.
The main institutions, the key institutions for Europe, really, both transatlantic relationships and NATO, says Nikolaus Meyer-Landrut. John McLaughlin, let's get the view from Washington, let's get the view from the US here. Would you reciprocate those kind words uttered by Nikolaus Meyer-Landrut? Is the transatlantic relations, is that still the key relationship looking from where you're sitting, looking from Washington?
Well, certainly I agree with the ambassador when he says that the European Union and NATO are the anchors, the key institutions of that relationship. And I believe it remains strong and will be strong into the future. It did suffer under the Trump administration, as everyone knows, from a variety of problems. And the Biden administration is seeking to improve that situation. Understandably, the Europeans, I believe, are looking, if not skeptically, they are looking questioningly at whether the Biden administration will be able to do that or not. Certainly, President Biden is intent on having a good relationship with Europe. All that said, it's just a reality that the relationship was formed in its strongest manner during the World War II and the Cold War with Russia, with the Soviet Union. And those days, of course, are past. And the United States, as is Europe, is focused on a variety of issues that were not as prominent then, such as China. So while the relationship remains strong, I think it has become more complicated. And that, I think, will be the theme for the future of the relationship. Strong, but complicated.
Strong but complicated is one way to put it, one way to describe the transatlantic relationships. Gülnur Aybet, Turkey, of course, is a valuable member of NATO and thus part of the transatlantic alliance. Strong but complicated is how John McLaughlin is describing transatlantic relations. Would you concur, or do you have a different version?
Yeah, I still think, I mean, I would agree that, you know, it's definitely a much more complicated relationship than before. I mean, there's two dimensions to this. First of all, there is the transatlantic core, the transatlantic relationship that was founded in 1945 between Western Europe and the United States. And then there's the second parameter of this, where Turkey fits into that relationship. Now, throughout the Cold War, Turkey was what we would call more of a functional ally, you know, one that was appreciated for its assets, but not really one that was a genuine strategic partner. And I see that, you know, as the region is changing, the world is changing, and Turkey is really, I mean, taking its place as a strategic partner. It's becoming less of one to the transatlantic relationship because the key players here, the key actors in the core, the traditional key actors, Europe and America, are not very comfortable about these changes. And there's basically been two things that the transatlantic relationship, that's Europe and America, that relies on. First of all, it's always having an other. So it's something that rose from the ashes of the Second World War, and then it had this thing against communism, and then against radicalism, the global war of terror, and so forth. But it's also had a very liberal normative ownership of a liberal world order. So these are now being challenged by two things globally. The first is the re-emergence of great power rivalry with the emergence of Russia and China. The second is actually a new ideological struggle that's happening within the West, and that's the ideological struggle between liberalism and mercantilism. And I think these clashes are making the transatlantic relationship meeting a lot of new challenges. That being said, dealing with Turkey in a new world with a new set of problems is something that's new for the transatlantic relationship, but also it's something I think both Europe and the United States understands, that they cannot manage this change, this profound change that's happening both globally and regionally without Turkey.
Ricardo, the world is certainly in motion, as Gülnur Aybet said. That poses a set of new challenges. Many new actors are on the horizon that weren't there probably before, and that are changing the landscape and the nature of transatlantic relationship. So give us your view to round up the first status quo assessment here, how you see transatlantic relationships in the 21st century.
Well, I'd say that the transatlantic relationship today is both challenged, but also it is still strategically very much relevant to both the United States and the European countries and the European Union as such as an organization. It is challenged because of a different structure that the international system has been has been taking on increasingly in these first 20 years of the 21st century. A structure which most people refer to as being multipolar, in the sense that there are more poles, global poles, around which international influence revolve. and that obviously complicates matters. But I would go as far as to say that today's international system is even more complex in the sense that it is characterized by a bipolar competition between the United States and China. But there are elements of actual multipolarity that makes this bipolar competition more complicated. So, for instance, let me just illustrate the point. The United States and China are the only countries in the world that have comparable resources across key strategic policy dimensions: economic size, military strength, and technological innovation capacity. That said, there are other countries that, while not matching US and Chinese capabilities across the whole spectrum of policy dimensions, do have some massive resources in at least one of these policy dimensions. For instance, the European Union is an economic powerhouse. Russia is a military global power. And even more so, at a regional level, there are countries, including Turkey, that possess enough resources to play on the regional theater a comparable role to that of global powers. And that creates this very complex structure with multipolar interactions happening here and there across the globe.
Right.
But underlying all this, or over all this, there is this competition between the US and China, and these two elements, the bipolar and multipolar characters of today's international system, will impact and challenge heavily the capacity of the transatlantic partners to exert leadership and coordinate policies.
Absolutely. All four of you have described the transatlantic relationship in a probably very realistic, somber manner, and there's a lot to unpack here, so let's get right to it. Ambassador Meyer-Landrut, many Europeans blame Donald Trump for the deterioration of EU-US relationships. There were high hopes placed in President Joe Biden, of course, who said very famously at the Munich Security Conference, the US is back. But even he, of course, cannot change the fact that, as you've all pointed out correctly, the US focus is so much more on Asia-Pacific these days than it is on Europe. That is a reality that Europe has to come to grips with, no?
Well, I think we should take it from the challenges we are facing. And some of the challenges we are facing are the same. They're the same for the US, they're the same for Europe, they're the same for Turkey. So even if you have, as you describe it, different actors at different levels, if we take individual challenges we are facing, we'll see that there are common interests and that it is worthwhile for Europe and the United States, but also Turkey, to work together to solve these issues.
Can you be specific? But excuse me, Ambassador. Let me jump right in here because at the end of the day, you speak, of course, about common challenges. But when it comes to how both the US and Europe are viewing China, that's fundamentally different, isn't it? I mean, the US views China first and foremost as a security threat, as a challenger in the 21st century, where for Europe there's certainly very hard-based economic interests at stake. Would you not agree?
Well, we have clearly said that China for us is, at different levels, a strategic competitor, a trading partner. So we have at different levels in our relationship different issues to deal with China. But the European Union has clearly identified China also as a systematic competitor in certain areas, as a in the wider world. So we'll have to see how we deal with this. It's not only about trade; it's also about the role China takes in the wider world. So we will have perhaps a more differentiated approach than just rivalry. But there are issues in the relationship between EU and China which are challenging for us, and where we are probably much more on the US side than anywhere else. On the other hand, for Europe, it would not be very comfortable if it feels that it has to choose between China and the United States. That would be a very complicated situation. So we need to work on the areas where we have a common interest with the US to see how we can influence China. And we will need to protect our more particular European interests in our relations with China as well.
John, the ambassador said it would be quite complicated for Europe to be put in the middle of this great rivalry between the US and China if it were to be forced to pick sides. But that is, let's be honest, that is what Washington is expecting, isn't it? They're saying, look, if we are part of the same value system, if we are part of the West, clearly you have to side with us here.
No, I don't think Washington is insisting that Europe take sides. Again, I used the word complicated before, and I think this is complicated. No, if you look at the realities of it, China is Europe's largest trading partner now. It is America's largest trading partner, and Europe and the United States are not far apart in terms of the value of that trade. It's in both cases over 500 billion euros. So there's a commonality of interest there on the economic side that I think the United States should work on. And also, Europe and the United States share some common interests in terms of the way we approach China. And there are a number of instances in the past where we have cooperated together with China on problems that are common, such as Iran. Certainly the Europeans probably share some of America's concerns about North Korea and about the stability and the relationships that we all have with other countries in Asia outside of China. And also, I would say that it is difficult at this point to easily characterize the American approach to China. It is, I think, oversimplified in much of the press. In truth, the relationship that the United States has and will have and must have with China has many dimensions. There's a dimension of partnership on some issues. For example, we have worked together on North Korea in the past, and certainly without a partnership on climate issues, the climate change will not be addressed globally. I'm not saying that that's perfect at the moment, but that certainly has to be a goal on the part of the United States, and that's another area in which the Europeans and the United States would share an approach and an interest. So there is a certain area of partnership that's potentially there. There's an area of rivalry, of course, on the economic side, where we are competing for markets, where the China has the comprehensive, is very active in the comprehensive partnership in Asia. The United States, I think, foolishly removed itself in the Trump administration from the Trans-Pacific Partnership and is now trying to find a way to rebuild those relationships. China, of course, has its Belt and Road Initiative. It has the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. So there are a lot of areas, and many Europeans belong to the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank.
Right.
So the United States does not. So there's also, what have I said, partnership, there's some rivalry, and then there's a potential of an adversarial relationship, which we must always be careful to not provoke or to excite in some unwise manner. Of course, that potential is there in a number of areas: South China Sea,
Taiwan, Hong Kong,
the air
sure.
identification zone, Taiwan, Hong Kong, all of that is there. So again, the United States has a complicated, well, let's say multifaceted relationship with China, and in many of those facets, I think the overlap with Europe is striking.
Right.
So it doesn't have to be Europe choosing.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be Europe choosing, but Gülnur, I bet Turkey is, of course, geographically part of Europe and part of Asia. Where does your country fall in between these conflict lines? We've already listened to both Ambassador Meyer-Landrut and John McLaughlin saying, yes, there are some tensions, but at the end of the day, Europe and the US will come to some sort of working agreement with China. But where does Turkey fall into this?
Turkey, as you know, is in recent years has emerged more of a regional player. So at the same time, its traditional role as a country that undertakes a lot of military roles within NATO and strategic roles within NATO has not changed. So it's an important partner within NATO, but at the same time, its growing regional role, where the transatlantic alliance, for example, cannot take a leading role, is actually surpassing what NATO could have done or what the transatlantic relationship could have done in the region. Just to give you an example, Turkey is able now, like it wasn't before, to change the realities on the ground in its region, from Libya to Syria, but also in its support to Azerbaijan in the recent Nagorno-Karabakh operation that they launched, which actually made the Minsk group quite ineffective and de facto implemented the UN Security Council resolutions, which were not implemented for over 20 years. So again, it's this ability, which is a new role. And in that, there have been tensions where our transatlantic allies have not quite grasped or understood this changing role of Turkey in a more positive light, where there's so much for cooperation there, but rather being more critical. Or probably, I think, maybe because of all these changes that are happening regionally and globally, the transatlantic core maybe do not like their allies to change too much in a changing world. But the reality is, as the world changes, your allies are bound to change too, especially if your ally is one that has a very important geostrategic location, like Turkey. So Turkey's relationship, as you rightly said, I mean, it's got a very wide reach across its geography, part of Europe, stretching out to Asia. In relations with China, for example, it's part of the Belt and Road Initiative. It's an observer in the BRICS. So globally and regionally, it's foraying into all of these other areas and looking for new modes of regional cooperation. It has a working relationship with Russia, a strong relationship, but it's also a compartmentalized one. Now, I just want to bring one thing up, and I'm sure we'll pick this up later because I know you're going to ask me about Turkish-US relations somewhere down the line. But just to sort of add a little sentence here to wrap things up, we unfortunately have reached a point where we also seem to be having a compartmentalized relationship with the United States, a transactional one almost. And this, I must emphasize, was not Turkey's choice. We've always wanted to deal head on with the outstanding issues that we have with the United States, but the United States have chosen not to, if you like, to confront those issues as such, but basically tell Turkey what to do, which is what they're used to doing. And when that doesn't work, it's sort of sweeping things under the carpet and trying to have a transactional relationship as possible, and a compartmentalized one where you don't deal with. But the thing is, the question here, I think, and I'm sure we'll pick this up again, can you have a compartmentalized relationship with an ally? I think you can in the short run, just to manage things, but I don't think it's tenable in the long run. So, and
Well, certainly, indeed, we will pick up the relationship not just of Turkey with the US, but with the West, so quote unquote, in general with Europe. But you've already laid it out, and we're going to come back to that, Gülnur, I bet, without any doubt. Ricardo, I just want to round up this one theme that we've been going through, namely China and America's new Asia-Pacific focus. We talked about whether Europe has to decide or not decide, but at the end of the day, perhaps we should first and foremost establish whether Europe even has a unified approach to China before we can even talk about, which side it will pick and how it's going to position. What's your take, Ricardo?
My take is that having a unified approach to China for the EU, and I underline the EU here, the EU dimension is not easy, but because of how important, I would say even existential, to the economy of the European Union's largest and most influential member states, Germany, trade relations with China are, I think that at the end of the day, the European Union will find a way to have some sort of common line. The ambassador was recalling before this characterization of China as a partner, a competitor, and a rival, with which the European Union came out a couple of years ago. And on surface, it is strikingly similar to what Mr. McLaughlin was saying about the US strategy towards China. And when I say on surface, I mean that there are indeed converging interests, compatible at least interests between the United States and Europe when it comes to China. But there are also significant differences. And I'm not that sure that the United States does not expect Europe to take side when it comes to the conflict issues. Let me try to illustrate. Let's start from the issues on which the Europeans and the Americans do share interests. So they have, or better, they share concerns. Both the Americans and the Europeans have concerns about China's unfair economic practices, issues such as market access or forced technology transfer, or China's political use of technology exports, such as the 5G,
right,
or of direct investment, as in the context of the Belt and Road Initiative. But when it comes to and also the European Union and the US do see eye to eye when it comes to cooperating with China over issues such as climate or Iran's nuclear problem. But when it comes to the security of the Indo-Pacific region, when it comes to the protection of Taiwan's autonomy or the freedom of navigation in the South China Sea, there is a potential for conflict between the US and China, which will push US officials to pick up the phone in case conflict does break out and ask their European colleagues whose side are you with, and they will be expecting the response will be the US.
right.
And that will be a very hard response, very hard answer for the Europeans to give.
Without a doubt. We are half an hour into this discussion about the transatlantic relationship and the future of the West, and we've talked mostly about China. I think that's very telling. I think these are the signs of the times, and of course it's a topic that has to come up in this context, something that would not have come up if we had the same panel, would have had the same panel perhaps 10, 20 years ago. But as are the times, Ambassador Meyer-Landrut, let's pick up on transatlantic relationships again as far as most recent developments in Afghanistan are concerned. Obviously, the hasty withdrawal on the part of Americans were received with, let's put it diplomatically, mixed emotions back in Brussels and in European capitals. And it reignited the debate whether Europeans once again have to have strategic autonomy, have to stand on their own feet. We can no longer rely on the US as we once did, something that even Chancellor Merkel once said a couple of years ago. What do you make? What do you make of the debate about EU strategic economy in light of the hasty withdrawal of Americans from Kabul?
Well, let me make 2 points on Afghanistan and then one on strategic autonomy, or the discussion about strategic autonomy in the European Union. On Afghanistan, yes, you are right. There was some misgivings on the speed, on the way the withdrawal took place, and we have all seen and heard this, and this was difficult also for some European allies to get their own nationals out of the country and so on. But the second point on Afghanistan is that I think there are common lessons to be drawn by what you call the West, by America, by the European Union, by Turkey, about how these kind of interventions, long-lasting interventions, are supposed to be structured. What can be their objectives? We have now collectively left Afghanistan after 20 years, and around half of the population is depending on humanitarian assistance. So, I mean, there are lessons to be learned from this, which go beyond the question of only the moment of the departure. And I would hope that all actors involved would take a bit of a step back to see what went wrong in the wider framework, and not only on the last days or in the last weeks, and what lessons one can draw from that. So this is on Afghanistan. In terms of autonomy, I mean, there is a clear wish in the European Union to cooperate with NATO, that security issues are issues which we want to address together with NATO, but that the European Union and its member states, in its cooperation with NATO, need to have also the capacities at certain moments and in certain places to act autonomously. If, for example, the US chooses not to participate in a mission or in some area. But we also need to be realistic that at this stage, and this will probably take some time, most of military, more important interventions, missions across the globe, the European Union and its member states will need support and cooperation with the US, at least be it on logistical and on other issues and on political support. So yes, there is thinking going on and action going on, I think, to strengthen the capacities, but not necessarily in a competition with with the United States of America, but also in a sense of being perhaps more complementary and be able to do things together.
John, as CIA's former acting director, I know I could have a panel just with you about what went right or wrong in Afghanistan. So try to answer just this question. Do you think the way, not just the US, the way NATO has withdrawn from Afghanistan is undermining the relevance, the prestige, the reputation of the alliance at a time when we're dealing with an emboldened Russia, when we're dealing with the Russian aggression in Central and Eastern Europe, when these kind of actions are being closely watched by Beijing? How much damage has Afghanistan done to NATO's standing?
Well, let me be clear that I'm speaking for myself and not for the U.S. government. I'm no longer a U.S. government official.
Of course, that's understood.
I think it's undeniable, really, that the ending of the Afghan war has damaged American credibility, the way it ended. We just have to face that. I mean, one could make it seem less so, and ultimately, I think the world does understand that the United States is a large, powerful country that is able to prevail in many military situations and in many other situations. But specifically on Afghanistan, it didn't end as everyone hoped it would. and ended in the way it ended, of course, created the perception. Whether reality is there or not is another question. In international affairs, perception is as important as reality, and certainly the perception was there of a faulty ending, and Russia, China, others have jumped in to exploit that perception in the world. And the reality of it is it didn't end, of course, as everyone hoped it would. I think when I look at Afghanistan, I have to remind myself that it is one of those things that happens in international relations that is unique. It would never have happened were it not for the unique nature of what happened on September 11, 2001, the attack on the United States. That's the only reason that the United States paid attention to Afghanistan in the way that it has for all of those years. And I recall, as all Americans do, that the NATO alliance invoked Article 5 at that moment for the only time in its history, and Americans remain grateful for that sign of partnership and support. I think in the United States there is great support, particularly in the Congress, for the kind of step back that panelists here and you have mentioned is required. We need really to reflect on what happened there over 20 years and what were the good things and what were the things that we regret about the way the whole thing unfolded. I don't think that we were as drawn into what many people call nation building as many think. It may have looked that way, but in truth, the goal throughout was to ensure that Afghanistan did not become, again, a haven from which major terrorism could be launched. And so many of the things that were done subsequent to our intervention in 2001, whether in the nature of civic action projects, road building, hospitals, education, all of that, I think, was intended in large part, as one of our ambassadors
Right.
was saying the other day.
John, let me just
It
jump
was
in here quick.
intended.
Let me just jump in here just quickly and ask you again about, and then we move on, about the damage that you think, if there's damage to the alliance, to NATO, how much damage has the hasty withdrawal in Afghanistan created for the standing reputation, for the prestige of NATO? Do you think it's been damaged?
I don't think it's permanently damaged. No, I think these things come and go in international affairs, and yes, it created a moment of perception of failing, and others will exploit that.
Right.
But in my experience, over a long period of time, these things come and go, and I don't think a year from now people will be thinking about that, just as when we reflect back on the history of American relations with Europe, we can find many moments in the past of high tension with Europe over a variety of things, going all the way back to the 1970s and 1980s, and extending through the Iraq period. But ultimately, the things that tie and the things that bind are stronger than the things that separate when it comes to this relationship. And when I say Europe, I'm including Turkey in that. The
Right.
things that tie are stronger than the things that break.
And let me bring in Gülnur Aydet here, because Turkey has been mentioned, and Turkey obviously has played a very large, very integral role in the NATO mission in Afghanistan throughout the past 2 decades. Now, John is saying, yes, this doesn't look good for NATO, but at the end of the day, this is, as I understood him, a temporary hiccup. This is something that will be forgotten. Do you share his sense of optimism or his assessment, or would you say, no, NATO's standing and reputation is under assault and has been damaged? What's your take?
Well, look, I mean, like you said, Turkey has twice taken the role of commanding the International Security Assistance Force, ISAF, in Afghanistan. it played an important role in resolute support, which was the continuing NATO mission. So right from the beginning, Turkey's had a very important role there. But I think Turkey's role in Afghanistan, one of the things that was really unique was that Turkey was probably the only NATO force that had earned that degree of trust and sympathy among the locals. And I think that is an asset that also our NATO allies repeatedly also told me that, as part of a NATO force, but also their ability to work with the locals and have earned that much trust and respect was quite something. And in fact, our NATO allies were thinking that in the future, Turkey would continue to play a role because of that role that they had established over 20 years. But the point is, the hasty withdrawal, of course, has now left us all in a bit of a let's wait and see what we do next approach. And especially that with Turkey, I think that's the case as well. I mean, we have been talking to the Taliban. We did actually offer to play some role in securing the airport, but for now, that is sort of something that is not happening in the immediate set. And we have also reiterated to the Taliban that they have to have a much more inclusive government, and they have to pay more close attention to human rights, particularly rights of women and women's education. So Turkey in all of this is actually, again, playing a much more proactive role, waiting to see what happens. Now, with regards to the role of NATO, let's not forget that when, this has been a very long intervention, in the one in Afghanistan. And the way that long interventions are is that, the reasons you went in the first place, the time of when you first went in, things have actually changed a lot since then. And we're dealing with a different region, a different world, and new realities. Therefore, I think, for what it was, NATO's mission there in preventing the spread of terrorism, particularly after something like 9/11, was actually a success. Was it a success in bringing stability to the country? To some extent, and in some areas, no. So, and again, we need to question also what is NATO's real role. Let's not forget, this is an organization that started off, which its core function is to provide collective defense to its member states. In the 1990s, that role emerged as one that would provide collective security for the greater good, when it actually started to act as the military arm of the UN in various operations in the Balkans, and became heavily involved in things it wasn't really supposed to do, such as state building. And then we got this footprint in Libya and Syria where we don't see NATO at all. And that led to some kind of disappointment, like, we're supposed to do this. And the point is, no, it's not. It only does these things for regional or global stability if the member states agree to do so. And the UN tasks it to do so, but it's not its core function. So again, I think just to wrap up, I think we have to be careful about what our expectations are of NATO as well. Maybe we need to revise and review the way we look at our expectations of the transatlantic alliance in a new changing world. And that does include Afghanistan, but beyond that, also Afghanistan's region, such as Central Asia. What's going to happen with Central Asia? What's going to happen with all these, new factors that are coming into play in the region, such as great power rivalry? So again, we really need to think about the limitations and what NATO can do beyond the borders of its member states.
Ricardo, we have to be realistic about what NATO can do in the 21st century, says Gülnur Aybet, or what the mission really is of the alliance amid these new challenging situations that we find ourselves. But again, the issue of EU strategic autonomy is something that the French President Macron oftentimes throws in the midst of making the point that Europe has to move from just being a soft power or an economic powerhouse, as Ambassador Landrut said, to also a hard power in times like these. We can no longer just fall back on the security and reliance on Washington as we did for 7-8 decades. What's your take?
My take is that President Macron is right, that the European Union needs to develop greater capacities to act on the international stage as an autonomous security player. Strategic autonomy does not mean independence from the United States. That is practically impossible or near to impossible. I mean, you would need an amount of investment in military capabilities, a degree of institutional integration of security and defense decision-making bodies at the EU level over a sustained period of time, which is simply not attainable. And even if you did that, the end result would not be as good or as powerful as what the US security guarantees offer the Europeans. So strategic autonomy will never be the same as fully autonomous foreign and security policy. The phrase somehow is, I mean, it is easy to frame the phrase as if the US, as if the EU or France was after and the decoupling from the United States, but that's not the case. That's certainly not the case even for France. Security cooperation with the United States is too important for France, for instance, in the Sahel or non-proliferation issues such as the Iranian nuclear issue, and it is of course existential for basically all or almost all member states of the European Union, especially those located in Central and Eastern Europe, and which face a potentially military threat or aggression from Russia. So I would say that having said that, strategic autonomy is important because the European Union and the European Union member states need to become more capable of contributing to the security partnership with the United States, both by creating greater military capabilities and taking on greater responsibility for their own security and the stability of the surrounding regions, but also to be able to rebalance the relationship with the US so that the United States does not just expect the EU to follow, but it is also willing to follow EU advice more than it does today, which is not that often.
Well, I think it's been, Ambassador Meyer-Landrut, it's been established here that certainly the United States is looking towards the Asia-Pacific region, certainly still has Europe on mind. But I think there's no denying that Europe itself is going through quite some motions. Of course, in Germany, your own country, you're going to have a change in leadership after 16 years. You have countries like Hungary and Poland that are succumbing to some sort of populism and at least on the surface of it, no longer subscribe to European Western values. Is Europe still a partner here? I mean, Henry Kissinger once famously said, what's Europe's phone number, when he was asked about how the US should deal with Brussels and Europe. As a European ambassador, you find it sometimes frustrating with Brexit, of course, going from, you had the financial crisis, you had the migration crisis in 2015, you have Brexit. Is Europe still, I guess is my question, does it still have the source of strength from within to stand as a unified player on the international stage in the 21st century?
Well, Europe has always had to work to define its positions on the international stage. This is not new. This is something which we have seen over the last decades and which will certainly also continue. On the inside, and the question is, does Europe have the strength to develop its integration, its cooperation? I'm convinced that yes. It might at times be challenging. It might be challenging with individual member states. It might take time, and it certainly is very difficult once in a while to understand from the outside how Europe's decision-making processes are going on and where they will end up. So I I admit voluntarily that the EU decision-making processes are once in a while difficult to understand and perhaps also slow. But the underlying trends are strong. The need for cooperation is clear. There are many issues where every member state, even the biggest, knows that they cannot face these challenges alone. And this is counterterrorism, this is migration, this is climate change. Climate change being the big issue of this commission at this time, to put Europe in a position to make its contribution. So you will continue to see once in a while complex decision-making processes within the EU, but you will also see a determination of EU member states to come out with common positions, to contribute collectively to the issues at hand. And you will see within the European Union, and that's the issue to which you referred, that the rule of law, that the primacy of European law are cornerstones of the construction of the European Union, which will be defended.
So clear words from the ambassador. John, nonetheless, if we look at the reality on the ground, we've talked a lot about China, of course, we talked a lot about Afghanistan. Let's bring in Russia here for a second, a country that has already been mentioned in this discussion, that many in Europe actually see as a strategic threat to the West. You know, we know what took place in the Crimea and the Ukraine. We know what's happening in Belarus. At the end of the day, would you agree that in the 21st century, Russia still poses a strategic threat to the West and the transatlantic relationship? Is that the biggest, if you will, for lack of a better term, is that the biggest adversary at this particular point? Common adversary, I should say.
Russia Russia continues to present, I think, a puzzle for all of us. And of course, it's very different from China in that China is a rising power. Russia is trying to cling to some of its power. And it is, I think, playing a weak hand pretty well in the world in the sense of extending its own influence, despite a struggling economy and not being competitive on so many different levels. I think, and so much of it revolves around Vladimir Putin, and I think his goals are quite clear, which are to, secure his domestic situation, to extend Russia's influence in the world, to weaken the Atlantic alliance, and also to discourage it from getting any larger by accepting new members, to create a dependency in certain countries, particularly in the Balkans, that will limit their cooperation with the European Union and NATO. All of that. We have to remember, too, that I think Russia's power, in a way, comes from its willingness to break the rules that the rest of us accept, whether it's rules governing borders, long-standing rules traced back to the OSCE and so forth, with its invasion of Ukraine. Its willingness to break other rules of international relations, poisoning citizens abroad, for example, all of that. And we can't, when I think of Russia, I'm forced to always remember that they remain a nuclear power, and that this is a dangerous part of the relationship that we can't ever lose sight of. It's heartening to me. I'm glad to see that the United States and Russia have opened talks in Geneva again on arms control to start to think about a follow-on to the New START agreement that almost expired, but which was renewed for 5 years. By signature of President Putin and President Biden. So to bring all of that to a summary, yes, Russia remains, I don't know that it's a strategic threat except on the nuclear issue, but the way I tend to think of Russia is that it is trying to bring our influence, our meaning the United States, Europe, to include, of course, Turkey, those of us who adhere to common set of values, trying to bring our influence down to a level that is more commensurate with Russia's, which has been at a global level sinking, despite the fact that Putin has been able to exert considerable influence in certain areas, such as Syria, Libya, and so forth. So not a strategic threat in the sense that it once was, but certainly still a spoiler in international relations, and on the nuclear level, a country that we must deal with just for the safety of the entire world.
Right. Spoiler, Gülnur, I bet John McLaughlin is saying Russia's main aim is to weaken the transatlantic alliance, certainly drive a wedge between the member states. And Turkey itself irritated a lot of its Western partners by purchasing S-400 missile defense system, of course, from Russia, leading many people in Europe and the quote-unquote West to ask whether Turkey is still part of the West, whether the West is losing Turkey to Russia. Now, I understand the reasoning behind this has been put forth many times by the President and by Foreign Minister Çavuşoğlu, but could you unequivocally say here that all the notions in the capital of Europe that the West is in danger of losing Turkey to Moscow is unfounded?
Absolutely, it's unfounded. Look, I mean, if I could pick up from what we talked about previously, about how much the region has changed, the world has changed, Turkey has changed as well, and its ability to take matters into its own hands when its national security is being threatened, such as it was in Syria, and to be able to change realities on the ground. This has required possibly new avenues of cooperating with regional actors such as Russia, where Turkey's national security concerns have not necessarily been, I wouldn't say put the word met, but actually been seen to by the allied states in NATO. I mean, when the situation in Syria, for example, got really bad before the current situation with a terrorist group, the YPG, which is equivalent to the PKK on the border, which is a real national security threat to Turkey. But before that, when there were just skirmishes on the border, I'm talking way back 2012 or so, and there were rockets that landed in Turkey. This was also a serious border issue, as a security threat. And NATO, Turkey called on NATO's Article 4 many times and convened the North Atlantic Council, the Allied Mobile Force, for example, in previous attempts before this current crisis was deployed, and also NATO Patriot missiles. So there have been cooperation on that level, but it hasn't really met Turkey's urgent national security needs. So one aspect. The other aspect, of course, is you mentioned the S-400. Now, Turkey has known for over 25 years that it's got a serious gap in its missile defense capabilities, and it has sought to mend that by seeking different alternatives. And the Patriot alternative from the United States, it just didn't materialize. And at the end of the day, Turkey chose the S-400 because it was the system that answered its needs for that particular time. Now, as Secretary General Stoltenberg has also mentioned, NATO does not interfere in the private procurement choices of its allies. But I must say the S-400 issue, I think, is much more strategic, political for the United States than strategic, military, or technical, because we did try to address the issues that were a concern to the United States on this by, for example, offering to set up a committee, a technical committee, to look into all the details. And the United States, from the very beginning, were very adamant that you just have to give it back. You shouldn't have it at all, which wasn't really a tenable, position for us to take, because we've already made with Russia. So for the United States, I think it's much more a political strategic thing of not giving Russia that area of influence in the region, rather than a technical military strategic concern that one of its allies is buying a system that is not compatible with NATO systems as such.
Right. So the West is not at risk of losing Turkey anytime soon, for that matter, Ricardo. Nonetheless, the issue, of course, on how to deal with Russia in the context of transatlantic relationships is always there. There are some European member states who advocate for dialogue with Moscow, who try to reach out. Some say it's a hopeless cause. We probably have to just weather out this storm. What is your take? Again, we're talking about a unified EU approach here, common EU foreign policy that does not seem to exist.
Well, let me start with two disclaimers, so to speak. So first, Russia is not in decline. Russia has lost an empire, but in the last 20 years, it has become richer, wealthier, more resilient, and again, pretty influential, if not globally, in critical geographical theaters, ranging from Eastern Europe to the Mediterranean, to the Middle East, to Africa, to Central Asia, and even to East Asia. So it's not a country you cannot really ignore. It's not a country you can really belittle. The second point I wanted to make is about the expectation that the EU should always have a common foreign and security policy, or at least policy position. That is preferable, of course, but that's not what the EU is. The EU is many, many things, but most of all, it's an organization that has created structural avenues for a number of sovereign states, specifically sovereign in the foreign policy field, to cooperate according to rules and established practices. And I would say that in the 2010s, so EU member states find more common ground on Russia than the early years of the early 2000s had. So I wouldn't say that Russia is so a divisive issue as it was in the past. Of course, it remains an extremely complicated issue. Because Russia is a complicated country and it is at times an intractable government to deal with. So Russia does one thing very well. It knows how to play the multipolar game. It knows how to play power politics. And it has learned from its own mistakes. Russia's military performance in the war against Georgia in 2008, while the war was victorious, the military performance was disastrous. In Ukraine, they were much more successful. In Syria, they have been successful at doing something the United States had not been as successful at doing in Iraq, for instance. Of course, there are differences between the two situations, but the Russian military performance and strategic performance in Syria, in terms of achieving the goals, has been mostly a success, whereas the US performance in Iraq, in terms of achieving its own results, hasn't been as successful. And I'd say that of the NATO member states, Turkey is probably the one that has learned the most how to play these multipolar games and to interact with Russia, even though Turkey and Russia have very diverging views on Nagorno-Karabakh, on Syria, on Libya. So these are pretty significant strategic differences, but somehow the Russians and the Turks have found a way to establish a constructive engagement. I would say that the Europeans would need to do something along those lines and also try to recapture a bit of Turkey's interest in deepening ties with the Europeans, because not only economically speaking, the relationship between the two is far more significant than the relationship between Turkey and Russia, but on those issues I've just mentioned, the EU is closer to Turkey than it is to Russia. However, there is a condition for that, and this is a condition the Turks are not very sensitive to that. The sine qua non for even a competitive relationship between the West and Russia to get some stability is for the Europeans and the Americans to create a credible deterrent against Russia's information warfare and interferences in European and American domestic politics. For as long as that goes on, the relation, even a competitive relationship, will never be fully stabilized, will be always prone to escalation and,
Right.
and to a worsening of its state.
So a plea for a more pragmatic approach, if I heard you correctly, in dealing with Russia rather than a dogmatic one, as the one that has that Ankara has.
If I may say,
Go ahead.
a more defensive approach, a more robustly defensive approach when it comes to Russia's interferences in the domestic politics of Western countries, and greater pragmatism when it comes to issues such as Syria, Libya, or just as the Russians have shown pragmatism on the Iranian nuclear issue, where they have been pretty helpful.
Sticks and carrots, so to speak. We are over an hour into this very lively, very interactive debate here. We have approximately 25 minutes left, Ambassador Meyer-Landrut. Let me pick up on the title of this session. It doesn't just state the transatlantic relationship, but it also states the future of the West. And the West is being put in quotes, which leads me to ask you, in this day and age, in the 21st century, are they still common, what we called Western values? I mean, they might, if you ask someone in Budapest these days what Western values are, might fundamentally differ from those in Berlin. And the same goes if you ask a Trump voter what Western values are, probably differs quite a bit from those who have voted for Joe Biden. So are they still common Western values? It's a term that is being thrown around quite a bit in diplomatic circles. But would you concur that perhaps the term is no longer as bulletproof as it once was?
Well, the basis of both the European integration and the transatlantic relations are value-based. And I think this is a very strong and very important fundament of this forms of cooperation or integration in the case of the European Union. And you say, if you ask a person on the street in Budapest, if you ask two different persons in Budapest, you might get two different answers. So the discussions in member states is, of course, ongoing. I would think that the strengths of democracy, the strengths of rule of law, the strengths of also the independence, judiciary, and human rights is something which people ultimately will always perceive as being very, very important for their own future. And when I speak to young people across Europe, including in Turkey, I hear this very, very often. So I'm quite reassured that the basic values which we share are there, but we have to defend them. We have to explain them. We have to explain them in a world where, in social media and so on, all sorts of also conspiracy theories are shared, which make it difficult to reach out to certain people. So I think we have to perhaps make greater efforts to explain to a wider public, and in particular those who are in their bubbles, what these values are all about and why they are in their interest. So I would say, to sum it up, I would say yes, they remain the basis and they are fundamental for our constructions. But yes, also I think we need to do more to bring them out, to defend them, to explain them in as a wide part of the society as possible.
John, would you concur, listening to the ambassador, when we talk about the West as a concept, as a concept of values, really, at the end of the day? We're talking freedom of speech, freedom of press, independent judiciary, democracy, plurality, all these terms that Europe embodied and and personified for many decades. Now, of course, you have populism gaining ground. You have the rise of the far right. On both sides of the Atlantic, by the way. Is that something that concerns you, that perhaps the notion of the West, of Western values, is no longer as strong and solid as it once was, that it is in decline, as some people might argue?
Well, I think, of course, the easy answer is to say we all adhere to these values, and they are, as enumerated by the ambassador, I think, unassailable. Things like human rights, commitment to democracy. I would add to what we might call the rules of the global commons, whether maritime or in the air. All of these things are values that we all, and rules that we all generally accept. But there's something different today. I don't quite know how to define it. I would say in a world that is as globalized as this one, it's a little harder than it was in the past to speak in terms of West, if one thinks of West as having an opposite being East. A lot of these things are now emerging, I believe, and also, it isn't just that democracy is under threat, as it is on both sides of the Atlantic at some level. It's that the system that democracy represents is now competing with other conceptions of effective governance in the world, and I think still retains the merit of history and of performance, and as Winston Churchill said, it's still the best system that anyone has come up with, despite all of its complexities and downsides. So again, I guess I'm saying, yes, I agree that the fundamental values of the West are intact, but I would say they're under some competitive assault from different parts of the world, I guess mainly from China. The one thing I would add to it is that I worry most about is that undergirding all of this concept of West is a commitment to, the values of the Enlightenment, really. The belief in rationality, the possibility of getting to some understanding of truth through open exchanges of information. I think that's critical, open exchanges of information that is factually based. And that is, after all, not a universally shared value. When you look at the number of countries in the world that, again, primarily the autocratic countries or countries that limit their citizens' access to information, whether China or Russia to a degree, Korea, North Korea, and so forth. That to me is one of the big dividing lines in the world, is to what extent do governments encourage and permit access to data by their citizens, which is at the base, at the end of the day, is the foundation for a successful democracy. If in a democracy, which we all hold as a common value, if in a democracy citizens make the decisions, citizens have to be informed. They have to have reliable data, reliable information. And that dimension of democracy undergirding our value system is under assault in many respects through social media. Referring back to the comments made just a moment ago by our colleague from Rome, I believe, that the fundamental thing we have to worry about with Russia is false information that is circulating in our countries as a result of cyber intrusion.
Right.
That is an assault on our value system and on democracy, which kind of undergirds everything else. So I think that those are my thoughts on this.
Absolutely. Gülnur Aybet, again, when we talk about the future of the West as it is being put forth here in the title of our session, the notion of the West sometimes, again, is under assault, is being in discussion, because at the end of the day, a robust democracy is what holds the transatlantic relationship together, is what made the transatlantic relationship so powerful and so strong as a counterweight to authoritarian governments. Now, according to a study by the National Endowment for Democracy, democratic countries, Western democratic countries in particular, are more susceptible to authoritarian tendencies today than at any other time in the post-Cold War era. Is the notion of the West, as laid out both by Ambassador Meyer-Landrut and by John McLaughlin, about the values that we hold so dear and that we defend, are those still hold true in the 21st century?
Yes, I mean, like my co-panelists also said, I mean, these are universal values. But the key question is here, we need to sort of roll the film back and look at the origins of the transatlantic partnership and go back to 1945, when, you know, within a Cold War bipolar structure, there was also an effort to create a liberal world order based on, you know, rules, norms, and institutions. And within this, the liberal world order was also in control of discourses and how to shape them because of their ownership of ideas embedded in globally respected mainstream publications, media, and so forth. So, and I would put this, you know, among this, I would also put education, higher education, you know, the respected higher education places around the world, mostly in Europe and America, where people look up to. So in a way, there's a sort of paradigm making process here as well. Now, we need to ask ourselves today, how much is that being challenged when particularly we look at something like ownership of global norms and what it actually means? And I think the crux of the matter is when all of this was being set up and with a and its values, very important part of it, there was a certain oughtness. I mean, that's what I've invented, and you can't really find it in the Oxford Dictionary, but oughtness is basically like, this is the way governments ought to act in the world. This is the way things ought to be. And so there was a sort of shaping process there. And I think that has actually come under a lot of challenges where, you know, do we really need to look at how the transatlantic core defines how these norms ought to happen? And we're entering a period where trust in institutions is wavering. And I must say that's not necessarily the fault of institutions or member states, but just the way sort of global relations between states, new power rivalries, new regional challenges have emerged in a way that institutions are not perhaps able to deal with all of these challenges in the way that they were set up to do so. And this has obviously led to a questioning of values, norms that are imposed by institutions. But I think also at the basis of this is what you talk about, the West in inverted commas. Recently, for example, at the Munich Security Conference, we talked about this notion is, are we drifting towards a dangerous Westlessness in the world, or is there a post-Western world? And in all of this, I think I want to take you back a little bit as well. I made an intervention at the Brussels Forum in 2014, so it was about 7 years ago, and I said, I'm really concerned that we in the West are still using phrases and discourses that have emanated from the Cold War, but more significantly from the 1990s. And I said, I think that the danger is that 20 years on, will still be the same people sitting in the same room, using the same phrases and concepts, but the world outside will have changed so much beyond our recognition.
Right.
And the more tragic part of it is that we'll no longer be part of it. So I think this is something that the transatlantic core are now beginning to come into some kind of realization. Maybe we're not heading towards a Westless world as such. I still think, the transatlantic core and these institutions are still quite robust. There's nothing quite to replace them, but the challenges they face are very, very important, and we cannot afford to be relaxed by sitting in a time warp of the 1990s where conditionality, for example, becomes very condescending at the same time, and we're quite blind. Therefore, we need to have a new discourse on values that is much more inclusive.
We need to have a new discourse on values, says Gülnur Ayber. Ricardo, would you agree that perhaps the old concept of Western values that we hold so dearly and projected throughout many decades perhaps is no longer valid? I don't want to say, but perhaps needs to be adjusted to realities of the 21st century. What do you say?
The discourse about it should be adapted to new realities of this new century. But the values themselves and the ideas behind those values, I mean, they are universal in nature, or at least those who hold them dear think they are. And therefore, they never, their relevance, their validity never diminish. What may change and what has to change is the way these values and norms are mainstreamed into policies and into discourses before policies. So the normative dimension has always been part of the transatlantic relationship. It was not just a mantle the transatlantic partners donned. It was part of the actual glue alongside strategic interests that kept the two parts together, but also gave them a vision, a proactive vision of their role in the world. And so they could claim to be universalistic in their approach to the international system during the Cold War, even if there was a powerful resistance from the Soviet bloc, which was pretty powerful. It was not limited to the countries directly under the authority of the Soviet Union. This change in the 90s, this what Gülnur was saying, these 90s has been an era that has shaped the mindset of many people who still holds leading position in academic circles, but also in policy-making circles, and certainly in think tanks. Right. So we have inherited from the 90s this idea that values and norms born in the West and shaped by Western powers should be promoted abroad. Now I think the time is to refocus our attention to defend them at home from both domestic challenges and external factors, and on that basis of a stronger commitment to your values and norms domestically, re-engage more pragmatically with countries or governments, I should say, that do not share those values and actually challenge them. So you have to accept the challenge.
Accept the challenge for certain. We are almost at the end of this very informative session. We have approximately 5 minutes left, but I do want to do a very quick final round with the plea and request for short answers. I don't want to leave our viewers with all doom and gloom here, because at the end of the day, of course, we've talked about the rise of China. We've talked about an assertive Russia. We've talked about a wounded alliance, a wounded NATO, and we talked about Western values and how they are under threat in light of increased authoritarianism and populism. But, Ambassador Meyer-Landrut, at the end of the day, What still gives you hope in the 21st century amid all those grave challenges that we've discussed over the past 90 minutes? When you get up in the morning as EU ambassador, what still gives you hope that the transatlantic relationship will not only just survive, but also thrive in the 21st century?
All the young people I meet in Europe and Turkey, across the world, who strive for liberty and freedom.
The young people, the young generation is what gives you hope. They have, yes, and we see, of course, they have taken over the helm in very important fields like climate change, Fridays for Future, and so on and so forth. So the younger generation gives Ambassador Meyer-Landrut hope as far as the future of the Western transatlantic relations are concerned. John, what makes you optimistic as someone who's followed these relationships for a very, very long time?
Well, I agree with the ambassador. I teach graduate students now at Johns Hopkins University, and I find them to be inspiring. They are idealistic, ambitious, energetic, and out to change the world, as I suppose we all were at that point in our lives. And I find that very inspiring as I look forward. Also, the second thing, here we've talked about a number of values today that, despite all of the problems, are, I think, eternal values that unite the West and that we all support. And third, very quickly, I followed European integration from my days as a student in Italy back in the 1960s when Europe was just beginning to unite. And at every point when there has been a stumble, somehow Europe has picked itself up and moved to the next step. So I have great confidence that Europe will remain vibrant and more united than in the past, and that it will have a good partnership with the United States and with the adjacent regions.
So again, the younger generation.
So I'm optimistic.
That's good. That is very good. The younger generation and the ability to reinvent itself and adjust and adapt to the challenges of our time is what makes John hopeful. Gülnur, you're also a professor. You're also teaching young people. If we look at transatlantic relations and the future of the West in the coming years and the century, are you optimistic?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I would share, the views that, that there's so much in young people that gives us hope. And as you rightly said, I also teach at a university about the future. But I think they really need to be informed better, of course. It's a challenge for us to do, I think, especially those who are educators. They need to be better informed about the past. I mean, look at Europe. What a remarkable project it's been, where it's transformed a war system into a peace system that has lasted this long. And I think we really need to learn lessons from that, how things were actually built in 1945. Sometimes we're so stuck in the 90s, we forget about the origins. We're so stuck in, the moment where, the end of history, that sometimes we forget about George Kennan and all those other guys. So I think, we need to go back to 1945 and maybe rethink about, all the things that sort of set all of this up before we move on. But I think just for today, and talking about countries rather than, young people, which are also important. But I think the key here is that cooperation is essential in managing this change together. This is a profound change that's going on, and it can be managed together. So it's time to actually be very careful about how we set about cooperating in doing that. And I am optimistic because I know that on both sides of the Atlantic and within Turkey, there is a will to manage that change together.
Ricardo, 3 optimistic conclusions. The pressure is on you now to bring it home. But again, let's be realistic. As I said before, Europe has been sort of, at least in the previous 10 years, going from one crisis to another. Again, still, you're optimistic about the future? Not just about Europe, but transatlantic relations.
Well, I mean, I'm realistic in the sense that there are strong elements pointing towards an endurance of the transatlantic relationship. The most important being, but not the only one, but the most important being the fact that liberal and democratic institutions and societies, they are more resilient. They are more capable of adapting. And they remain the most appealing option, surely to individuals, but often also to societal groups and businesses. So that is an element that you can take as a reason for being optimistic, but it's a realistic element. But it's also realistic that democracies are not destined to remain democracy forever. They are subjected to reversals. We have seen in Poland, we have seen in Hungary, to an extent we've seen it also even in Turkey, and we are seeing it, unfortunately, and that's the most concerning part, within US society itself, especially within the Republican Party, which has become ever more a right-wing party, espousing authoritarian views. Now, it's a very complicated reality. It's not a truth that can universally be applied to the whole right-wing electorate in the US, but it is a new reality we have to take account of. So, realistically, there are elements for being positive, elements for being very much concerned.
Ending on a, let's say, cautiously optimistic, realistic note here. And certainly, I don't know if we've been able to leave our viewers here with a sense of hope and optimism when it comes to the transatlantic relationship and the future of the West. But I think one thing is for certain, and I can speak for all of us who have joined here today as viewers, this has been an extremely informative, very insightful, very content-rich debate from four very different views, very different voices and geographic regions. Nikolaus, Meyer-Landrut, Gülner Aybet, Johnny McLaughlin, and Ricardo Alcaro. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for your input. All the best. Thanks so much.